Good morning, everyone. I hope you had a good day yesterday. Thank you for having me here today. So I'm Anna Songhurst. I'm one of the directors of the Coexist Trust based in Botswana. And our whole focus is to try and find ways to reduce human-elephant conflict and foster coexistence. So we actually work in I'm going to kind of take you out a bit broader than Botswana and just introduce you to this area. This is called the Kavango Zambezi Transfrontier Conservation Area, which is actually part of Southern Africa, and it spans 5 countries, which is Botswana, Namibia, Angola, Zimbabwe, and Zambia. And this whole Transfrontier Conservation Area, obviously it's transboundary, and the whole aim of this area is to help to promote wildlife connectivity and to try and improve rural livelihoods across the landscape and promote tourism. That's simplified. But throughout this landscape, there are different kind of what they call wildlife dispersal areas, which is where the animals are then moving across to different countries. And so there are 5 of these wildlife dispersal areas, and where we work is part of one of the main ones called the Kavango WDA, which is here. So it goes between northern Botswana, up into Namibia, Angola, and up into Zambia. So when we collared elephants in Botswana, this is just a map of some 40 elephants and the movements of them. And we collared them all in Botswana, and you can see that they're moving out into Namibia, Angola, and some even went into Zambia. So then I want to zoom into that really big concentrated pink area, because that's where we primarily work. I forgot to say, sorry, across this whole landscape in the Kavango Zambezi, there's 220,000 African elephants, and they're a contiguous population, so they're moving throughout. And then if we zoom down into that pink area, which is where we work, this is called the Okavango Panhandle. And in this area, we have about there's about 35,000 people living across the whole of the Panhandle, but in this eastern side, I don't know if I've got a in this area here, we have about 18,000 elephants and about 16,000 people. And we have a Namibian Botswana border fence, and we have a northern buffalo border fence, and then this is the Okavango River, and then it spans out into the Okavango Delta, which is an inland wetland. And so in this area, we have people who have settled along the river. So you've got about 14 villages, and then it's a mixed-use area. So you've got arable farming, you've got cattle farming, and then you've got these 18,000 or 20,000 elephants, which are needing to get from dryland resources up here to come down to the Okavango River and to the delta, and they have to navigate their way through where there's villages and fields. And then obviously in the wet season their range expands, and that's when they start to move up into these big transboundary wildlife dispersal areas up into neighbouring countries. So we do see in this area that the elephants use quite distinct pathways to get down to the Okavango, and there is direct conflict when they then come across people. So we see a lot of direct conflict. There's on average about 1 person gets killed every year, about 25 elephants get killed every year. So there is that direct conflict. But the main form of human-elephant conflict in this area is actually crop raiding, so when the elephants are coming into people's fields. And we see that what's happening is a lot of the fields are placed on or next to some of these main corridors for the elephants. So over the years, what we've done is we've collected a lot of research data, and we've monitored and we've tried to see, okay, what makes one field more susceptible to being raided by elephants than others? And what we found, using lots of different variables to look at, we actually found that, as you would think logically, the closer one of these fields is to one of these main movement paths, the more likely they are to be raided by an elephant. So actually we could look at and we could see, okay, actually if a field is less than 1 kilometre to one of these paths, it's 50% more likely to be raided, which is quite substantial. And then we wanted to look at, okay, where are the elephants moving? They're clearly using these different pathways, but there are lots of pathways. So what's happening here with the movement? So to get that information, we did a lot of participatory mapping and talking to the local people and getting that indigenous knowledge, then going out there and doing ground surveys, monitoring, counting footprints and checking to see how many herds were using which pathways and how many elephants were in herds, estimating to try and look at the frequency of use of these different paths. And what we found was that actually elephants were using about 106 different pathways to get from this dryland area down to the Okavango. But they were using some of these paths much more frequently than others. And that's that we're talking on a population level here. So this is not to do with collaring data for this. And so those orange and that red path in the middle there are paths that they were using much, much more frequently. And there were 13 of those in total. And so then we looked at that in more detail and tried to understand why is that? Why are elephants using some of these paths more than others? And we found that it really actually related to people. And it related to the fact that elephants were clearly trying to avoid people as much as they could. They were trying to use paths which were away from most of the settlements, or if they were coming like areas where there was lots more kind of agricultural land and they were a bit more scared, then you would see that there would be a lot more elephants coming together in groups because it was kind of like a response to fear. So we realized that actually the elephants were exhibiting kind of risk avoidance behavior in this area. And that, along with the fact that we knew that the fields that were closer to these pathways were more likely to be raided, we realized that actually there's an opportunity here. Maybe these two different types of data sets can help us. Maybe there's a way of being able to help with planning and spatial planning in this area to help people and elephants live in the same area, because they're clearly already trying to. And they're already adapting their behavior, but maybe we just need to look at it in more detail and see how that can be done. And then we had the opportunity to contribute all of this science data into a project which was led by USAID, funded through USAID and a SARAP program, and the Tawana Land Board, which was actually the land authority in the area. So the land board reached out and they were realizing that there was a real issue with land use conflicts. So it wasn't really about human-elephant conflict, it was about land use conflicts where they were finding it really difficult to plan and to be able to find areas where the settlements could expand without overlapping on agricultural land, or where the cattle could graze but they weren't going to conflict with the arable agriculture. And then we had all this information about how actually the main land use conflicts in these areas around the Okavango is actually to do with human-elephant conflict, because there was so much conflict there. The farmers were angry. They were telling the land board that they shouldn't be allocating them on the pathways. They could see that it was exacerbating the conflict. So together we started this pilot project to see whether or not we could come up with a tool which could assist the land authorities with the land use planning and incorporating all this information. So this involved bringing together existing land use data, so looking at where all the settlements already are, where all the fields already are, looking at environmental data, checking to see what the soils were like in different areas, because if you're thinking about planning for the future, you need to know that kind of information. So all of where the water availability was and things like that. What it also involved in this process that we used, it's very much about bringing in preferences for land use, so coming from different stakeholders, so thinking about it from a community perspective, so lots and lots of meetings within the communities who were in these areas, asking them what is it that they needed for if they were going to be choosing their field, how do they choose their field, what's important to them. And then going up to the different government departments and asking them the same thing, thinking about the policy level, what's in the policy which affects land use. And then all of this information can go into this GIS model. And the one that we used is the one called the Land Use Conflict Identification System, which enabled you to gather all of this information along with that science data that we had to do with human-elephant conflict. And what came out of that then is that you end up with some maps which then show you where there are potential land use conflicts. So what we have here is the green areas actually show you where there is potential for agricultural development, it's good soils, but there's no conflict with other land uses. So it's outside of where the settlements can expand. It's not actually in an elephant corridor, or you've got the elephant corridors, which then can be left free and open for future development. Then you've got the orange areas, which is like where the settlements need to expand. So you look at it from the different land use perspectives. And then we use the 13 main corridors, because clearly you can't put 106 pathways into a land use planning area, because you do need some space for people as well. So the 13 main corridors are used in this model. And then obviously it was really important that after these maps and everything were made, we went back to the communities and made sure that there was a lot of consultation to check that we had the paths in the right place, that they were happy, that they agreed, actually, when we did that, the funny thing was we thought, we might come across where we need to change some of this. But actually what we found was that some people were like, hey, our corridor is not as big as their village. Why is ours not as big as that? Or we don't have one and we want one because we need a corridor near our village. We were actually really surprised, which was brilliant. But then it came out that you could then do it at a village level. You can see very clearly the different types of land uses. And then this model, and this tool, this map, obviously it's just a map. So then you need to be able to make sure that it can be implemented, it can be used by the land authority so that they can go out and start to allocate land according to these different zones, which will then help in the future to avoid land use conflicts and ultimately human-elephant conflict. And so that involved a lot of work with the technical officers and the surveyors within the land authority, transferring these maps onto handheld GPS units, making sure that they had the software on laptops so that they can then take that information from the field and bring it back onto their computers. And this whole process has been amazing. And now we've seen that this is a map that was produced by one of the land boards that we've worked with. So we started this whole thing in one sub-land board. And then we've been able to upscale this to other land boards because we've been asked to. And then this is a map which shows you that they have taken the information from the zones and then they have then incorporated this into their own system to show where then they are going to be able to allocate new fields, or they're going to have an area left open because it's where the wildlife are moving, or it's an area where the cattle are going to be able to graze. And so, like I say, we've managed to expand this now. We've done this in the eastern side of the Panhandle, so that area that I was talking about where you could see that really pink blob of elephant movements. And then we've done it around the western side of the Okavango in 3 more sub-land boards, and we're in the process of doing it in another 2 sub-land boards now around the southern part of the Okavango. And it's a big collaboration with the government department, and the whole idea is that this is a tool for them. So now we're working with them on how it can be incorporated into their system so that if people change within government, or if Coexist Trust isn't there, or to make sure that it can be maintained and be sustainable, see how it can fit into their systems and build a systems of records so that they will be able to utilize this into the future. And then in terms of the elephant corridors, and then coming back to really thinking about human-elephant conflict, obviously we needed to make sure that we demarcated these corridors. And a really important factor here was that it was the Tawana Land Board is the land authority, so they endorsed these signs and this demarcation of these corridors. But in addition, we also have the Department of Wildlife and the Department of Agriculture. So 3 key stakeholders within government are totally on board and see the importance of maintaining these corridors, allowing the animals to have the space they need, as long as then you have these areas outside. And then, like I say, for conflict resolution, then we needed to do a lot of work on short-term mitigation strategies, so safety, because obviously people who are walking in this area, and there are these big corridors with hundreds of elephants moving on them, we do a lot of work on safety, and we've started a thing called the Elephant Express bus, which helps to transport children across the corridors and take people to the clinics, so people who are vulnerable within the community. And then this whole land use approach, it kind of, if you want to maintain corridors, that's the next step. So yes, you've got them into a land use plan, but you want to make sure that they stay there. And so what we do with that is we've been looking, okay, well, if you need to have some kind of benefit coming back from those corridors, that's really important, coming back to the communities. You need to think about, okay, where these areas of agricultural land are, can we see if there's a ability to cluster fields and be able to protect those fields so that elephants don't get in there. And then thinking about enabling people to stay within those fields and practicing sustainable agriculture techniques. So it needs to be combined into a big holistic strategy if you're going to be addressing human-elephant conflict. Just quickly, I wanted to say that the reason I started at that landscape level was to show you that these micro corridors, when you're coming through areas where there's people living, are so critical when you're thinking about elephants, because they're a big, wide-ranging species. And if these little conduit kind of micro corridors coming through areas where there's people living are what is actually enabling you to then have these bigger wildlife dispersal areas and enabling this transboundary movement across a 5-country transfrontier conservation area. And so one thing that we've been working on, this is my last slide, just to let you know, is like across that landscape within the what we call CASA, we've helped to create what's called the CASA Elephant Subworking Group. And through that group, that is a group of practitioners like conservation NGOs, but importantly, government representatives from those 5 different countries, coming together, looking at the elephant population and how to manage that huge population of elephants, and combining information from all those 5 countries to look at movement data and connectivity. So now what we've been able to do is we've written a policy brief for the 5 countries, which has just been endorsed. And the next step now is we have this huge database, and we can see where these corridors are, and you can even see where these micro corridors are with that huge data set across the landscape. So what we're looking at is now where you're going to be able to look at how you can put interventions in place at a landscape level to enable these micro corridors across the landscape to be maintained. That is our aim. So then we hope that we'll be able to assist with maintaining this large population of elephants in this region. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Anna. And stay there, we'll have a question. That was great. That's a really good example of how you can use land use planning for an integrated solution that you need for the complexities of conflict. Anybody have a question for Anna? Yes, one at the back.
Have you got any data on the reduction of human-elephant conflict as a result of the land use planning?
Do you want me to answer each question?
Yes, you answer each question.
So yeah, it's a good question. So obviously, I missed this out at the beginning when I talked about human-elephant conflict, but the land use planning is a long-term solution to human-elephant conflict. So it's addressing one of the root causes of the conflict, which is competition for space. So when you say, have you seen a difference yet? That is hard to say, because what we're doing is now the land boards are allocating according to this, so they are no longer allocating arable fields on elephant corridors, which is amazing. But for us to say that, like, how much that has reduced conflict at the moment is too early to say, I think. So, yeah.
So there are 2 land elements that you have shown. One is the pathway, and one is the corridor that you have identified, the 13 corridors and the 100 something pathways. So what is the difference between pathway and the corridor, and how are you defining it? And is there any change across time in increase or decrease in these kinds of pathways and corridors?
Okay. Yeah, so it's a good question, because there's lots of different ways of defining elephant movement paths and stuff. So what we have said is that the elephant movement paths, they could be just one elephant moving on that path. but these corridors are where most elephants are moving most of the time. So they're the most frequently used elephant movement routes, if you like. And we're calling them a corridor because they include like that main movement path, but because of the data we had, and I think I forgot to say this as well, because of the data we had, there's actually buffers around those main movement paths as well to allow for that whole kind of reduction in human-elephant conflict down the line and a reduction in crop raiding. So there's like a kilometre buffer on either side of those main movement paths. So that's how we then differentiated that that's a corridor, and that's what everybody understands by that. But there are other movement paths, because obviously when you talk to people, and you know, if any of you have worked with elephants, they do move all over the place. But the point is that they are choosing these routes which are kind of the easiest route to get to the resources they need. And so those most frequently ones are the ones that we would define as a corridor, rather than just a one-off path. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Anna.
Cool.